Come on, dropout. Show us what you've got.
The grip on my arm tightened as Victor dragged me forcefully toward the stage. A magnificent grand piano stood there, waiting, its polished surface gleaming under the harsh spotlight. At this conservatory reunion, I was being forced to perform by the very person who had bullied me into dropping out years ago. From below the stage, my former classmates looked up at us with mixed expressions. Some showed concern, others curiosity, and a few wore barely concealed smirks of anticipation.
Does he still even play?
Someone whispered. "Oh man, this is going to be rough," another voice carried clearly to the stage. Victor turned to face the crowd with an exaggerated flourish.
Ladies and gentlemen, the legendary Sean Walker, our famous dropout, will now grace us with a performance.
He spun back to me, his smirk growing wider.
Come on, loser, let's hear what you've got.
It had been a while since I'd performed on a proper stage, and I felt a twinge of anxiety coursing through my body. But with all eyes on me, there was no escape. Resigned, I placed both hands on the keys. In that moment, the atmosphere in the hall shifted dramatically. I could hear the collective intake of breath, because they had no idea who I really was. My name is Sean Walker. My passion has always been listening to music, any genre, any style. That love affair with sound began in the most ordinary way possible, but it would lead me down an extraordinary path. I grew up surrounded by music, though not in the way you might expect. My parents weren't musicians themselves, far from it. My father worked as an accountant, and my mother ran a small flower shop. But when my aunt needed to relocate overseas for work, she needed to find a home for her cherished upright piano. My mother, despite our modest living space, didn't hesitate to take it in, not because she played, but because she had noticed how I would gravitate toward it during our visits to my aunt's house. As a toddler, I would stretch my tiny arms toward those ivory keys I couldn't quite reach. Adults would lift me up, guiding my small hands to make sounds that delighted me to no end. When that piano finally arrived at our house, it became my favorite toy, my constant companion. I learned to read music before I could do multiplication, and instead of asking for action figures or video games for Christmas or birthdays, I would beg for new sheet music. My early attempts at playing were far from melodious, but my family never complained. Instead, they'd join in with whatever they could find: tambourines, hand claps, even wooden spoons against pots. Those cacophonous family concerts became my favorite moments. Their unconditional support only made me love music more. During one of her visits, my aunt watched me play a simple tune I'd learned by ear. She turned to my parents and said, "This boy needs proper lessons. He has a gift." That's how I found myself at Mrs. Harrison's piano studio just down the street from our house. Mrs. Harrison was a retired concert pianist in her 60s with silver hair always tied back in a neat bun and fingers that seemed to float across the keys when she demonstrated pieces. She started me with proper music reading and basic classical pieces. "But Mrs. Harrison," I would protest, "I want to play the songs I hear on the radio." She would smile knowingly and adjust her wire-rimmed glasses. "Sean, dear, mastering the fundamentals will let you play anything you want later. Trust the process." Reluctantly, I agreed to Mrs. Harrison's approach, though I would still sneak in practice of my favorite pop songs when I could. Throughout middle school, my passion never wavered. I practiced daily, splitting my time between the assigned classical pieces and contemporary music that called to me. During one particularly frustrating lesson, Mrs. Harrison stopped me mid-piece. "Sean," she said gently, setting her metronome aside, "your Bach sounds like you're playing it with boxing gloves today. What's troubling you?" I sighed, shoulders slumping. I spend so much time on these old pieces when what I really want to play is different." She studied me for a moment, then walked to her filing cabinet. "Come here," she beckoned. Inside, she had countless folders of sheet music ranging from yellowed classical scores to contemporary pieces. Music isn't about old or new, classical or popular. It's about touching people's hearts. These composers you're learning from, they were the rock stars of their time. That conversation shifted something in my perspective. If I made music my career, I realized, I could play whatever I wanted. From that moment on, I approached practice with renewed determination. Where I had once rebelled against focusing on the basics, I now understood their importance for my future. Mrs. Harrison noticed the change immediately. "Now that's the sound of someone who's found their path," she said, after I performed a particularly challenging Chopin piece. She recommended increasing my lessons from 1 to 5 per week, and my parents agreed despite the financial strain. We weren't wealthy by any means. My father took on extra accounting clients, and my mother worked longer hours at her flower shop. They cut back on expenses, lived frugally, and prioritized my musical education. I never asked for anything non-music related, acutely aware of their sacrifices. One evening, I overheard them discussing finances in the kitchen. "We could take out a second mortgage," my father suggested quietly. "No," my mother replied firmly. "We'll make it work with what we have. Did you see his face when he played for us yesterday? That kind of joy. You can't put a price on it." Their conversation that night pushed me to practice even harder. The results showed. I began winning local and state competitions. Each trophy I brought home felt like a small repayment for their unwavering support. With my sights set on attending a prestigious conservatory, I built up my credentials and experience through childhood and adolescence. The day the acceptance letter arrived from Palmer Conservatory of Music, my parents threw a small celebration. Mrs. Harrison brought a cake decorated with musical notes, and my aunt called from overseas to congratulate me. But that's when the real challenges began. The competition at Palmer made previous competitions look like child's play. My classmates were more like rivals, all of them incredibly talented and technically proficient. Many came from prestigious musical backgrounds. Their parents were symphony musicians, conductors, or renowned teachers. During my first week, I sat alone in the cafeteria, taking in the conversations around me.
"Did you hear? Professor Matthews only takes students who've won international competitions. My father says connections are everything in this industry. You have to network with the right people."
"The winter showcase is crucial. If you don't impress the visiting conductors, you might as well give up."
I had thought enjoying music would be enough, But not everyone shared that perspective. Everyone was fighting for competition wins, connections with famous instructors, networking with alumni, looking far beyond just playing well. The required competition pieces weren't to my taste, which was stressful even though I understood their importance. I knew that if I couldn't master the prescribed pieces, I'd never be able to develop my own style. Still, spending my days practicing pieces chosen purely for their appeal to judges was wearing me down. The judges wanted safe, technically perfect, but soulless performances. There was no room for creativity or freedom. Every note felt restricted, every phrase calculated. It was far from the musical life I had dreamed of. To make matters worse, there was Victor Grant. From the moment he first saw me practicing in one of the rehearsal rooms, he seemed to have made it his personal mission to make my life miserable. He was also a piano major, and for some reason he had targeted me from the start. Perhaps it was because we had similar technical abilities, but completely different approaches to music. While I sought to connect with the audience, Victor played to impress. One afternoon, as I was working on a particularly challenging passage of Liszt, he appeared in the doorway of my practice room. "You know," he said, leaning against the frame with calculated casualness, "I heard you won all these competitions before college, but you're really not that special. Your interpretation of Liszt is pedestrian at best." I tried to ignore him, focusing on the keys in front of me, but he continued. "You really think you could compete with me at this level? This isn't some small-town recital where Mommy and Daddy can clap for you." I wished he would just ignore me if he thought so little of my abilities, but whether he wanted to eliminate competition early or was actually threatened by my presence, his harassment was relentless. He developed a routine of sabotage that grew more sophisticated over time. He would deliberately take my reserved practice rooms, leaving me scrambling to find space before important rehearsals. Right before performances, he would materialize beside me, whispering cutting remarks about my technique or interpretation. He seemed to take particular pleasure in destroying my confidence moments before I had to perform. One day, I caught him speaking with Professor Reynolds, my main instructor, gesturing animatedly while glancing in my direction. After that, the professor began treating me differently, becoming more critical and less patient during our sessions.
"Your playing lacks sophistication," Professor Reynolds would say, shaking his head. "Perhaps you're not ready for this level of instruction."
I often thought Victor should spend his energy practicing instead, and one day, after a particularly harsh critique session, I finally confronted him in the hallway. "Don't you have better things to do than sabotage others?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "Like practicing your own pieces?" Victor just laughed, the sound echoing off the conservatory's marble walls. "Oh, Sean," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder that felt more threatening than friendly. "I don't need to practice to be better than you. I was born for this stage. You're just pretending to belong here." Even when I placed well in competitions, he would find ways to diminish my achievements. After I won second place in the autumn showcase, he cornered me at the reception. "Your playing has no resonance," he said, swirling his champagne glass. "It's completely boring. The judges only ranked you highly because they felt sorry for you. Everyone knows you're only here because Palmer needed to fill their scholarship quota." Despite his own success, or perhaps because of it, he seemed obsessed with undermining mine. Each small victory I achieved became hollow under the weight of his constant criticism. Suddenly, the awards I'd won felt meaningless. The joy I once found in performing began to fade, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that followed me everywhere. The practice rooms, once my sanctuary, became spaces of dread. I would peek through the small windows before entering, checking if Victor was nearby. My fingers would shake on the keys as I anticipated his next appearance, his next cutting remark. Even in my dorm room, I couldn't escape his influence. My roommate, a violin major named Mike, noticed the change in me.
"You don't play like you used to,"
he said one evening as I stared at my sheet music without touching the keyboard.
"What happened to those amazing improvised pieces you would work on late at night?"
I couldn't explain how Victor's constant harassment had taken root in my mind, how his words played on repeat during every performance, every practice session. The conservatory became a place where I could no longer enjoy playing. My competition results plummeted. Where I once interpreted pieces with confidence and creativity, I now second-guessed every artistic choice. My grades suffered as anxiety prevented me from performing well in master classes. Even then, Victor's harassment only intensified. He seemed to feed off my declining performance, his smirk growing wider with each of my failures. I tried speaking with the administration, but Victor had carefully cultivated his image among the faculty. He was charismatic, always volunteering to help at department events, staying after class to engage professors in sophisticated musical discussions. My complaints were met with skepticism.
"Victor Grant is one of our most promising students," the department head told me,
peering over his glasses.
"Perhaps you're having trouble adjusting to the competitive environment here. Not everyone is cut out for professional classical music."
I had come here to pursue my passion for music my way. Instead, this environment was killing my love for it. The joy I once found in playing was replaced by fear and self-doubt. If it wasn't fun anymore, it wasn't music. I realized I was losing not just my ability to perform, but my very connection to music itself. After much agonizing and several tear-filled phone calls with my parents, I made the difficult decision to drop out of the conservatory I had worked so hard to enter. The day I went to clear out my practice room, Victor was waiting for me.
"So you're really leaving?" he asked, leaning against my locker. "Finally realized you're not good enough?"
I said nothing, focusing on gathering my sheet music and personal belongings.
"What a waste," he continued,
his voice dripping with mock sympathy.
"Think about how much money your parents spent getting you here. You're just throwing it all away. But I guess this proves what I've been saying all along. You're just a quitter who never had what it takes. Good riddance."
His words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they stirred up guilt about my parents' sacrifices. Victor's final attempt to destroy my musical career had succeeded. I had lost to him. But I told myself it was better than losing my love for music entirely. 10 years passed like a gradual crescendo. Then, surprisingly, I received an invitation to the conservatory reunion. The elegant cream-colored envelope arrived at my studio one morning, bearing the Palmer crest in gold foil. I sat at my desk, turning the invitation over in my hands. My initial instinct was to decline. Why revisit painful memories? But I kept in touch with a few friends from those days, including Mike, my former roommate, who had gone on to become a successful orchestral violinist. Besides, I was curious to see where everyone's musical journeys had taken them. The reunion was held in the conservatory's concert hall rather than a hotel. Walking through those familiar wooden doors felt like stepping back in time. The same ornate chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over the polished floors. The air still carried that unique mix of wood polish and anticipation. After exchanging greetings with a few former classmates, I heard a familiar voice that made my stomach tighten.
Well, 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 look who actually showed up!
Victor appeared, pushing through the crowd with the same entitled air he had carried a decade ago. 10 years hadn't changed his demeanor at all. He still moved like he owned the room, though his hairline had receded slightly and his prestigious conservatory blazer seemed a bit tight around the middle.
I can't believe you actually had the nerve to come,
He said, sizing me up.
I'd be too embarrassed to show my face if I were you. After all, you're the one who cracked under pressure and dropped out.
I wanted to remind him whose fault that was, but I didn't want to sour the reunion atmosphere. Instead, I managed a weak smile and tried to move away.
I've made it as a professional pianist, you know,
He continued, following me.
Got scouted by a major agency and everything. What are you doing these days? Teaching piano to tone-deaf kids?
I'm still in music, I replied carefully.
Seriously?
Victor's smug expression transformed into one of clear displeasure. His face reddened slightly, as if the very idea offended him. Apparently, the thought that I was still involved in music after he had worked so hard to drive me out was unacceptable. I wished he would just leave me alone, let the past remain in the past.
You dropped out, but you're still clinging to music? He scoffed. How pathetic. There's no way any agency would take you.
Oh, I'm actually independent, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them.
Independent?
The word seemed to catch in his throat. I knew what he was thinking. Many artists actually aim to succeed independently rather than sign with agencies. His reaction suggested he was one of those who hadn't managed it, trapped in the corporate structure he'd once praised as the only legitimate path.
Ha! Independent? You mean unemployed, right? How embarrassing!
Victor was laughing so hard he could barely speak, though there was an edge of desperation to his mirth. Laugh if you want, but I make a good living from music, I said quietly. I'm doing fine, thanks. That's when he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear.
Then show us what you've got.
What? Before I could process what was happening, he was dragging me toward the stage. It happened so quickly I couldn't resist and could only try to keep my balance as I followed. The grand piano waited on stage, its lid raised like an expectant mouth.
Come on, play something you like,
Victor announced, his voice carrying across the hall.
Hey everyone, Sean's going to perform for us.
His call drew attention from all corners of the room. People gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern.
Sean? Really? Didn't he drop out? Can he still play? Oh man, this is going to be rough.
Their whispers floated up to the stage like autumn leaves. Victor, clearly enjoying the spectacle he'd created, played to the crowd with theatrical flair.
Ladies and gentlemen, the former prodigy Sean Walker will now grace us with a legendary performance. Let's see if he remembers which end of the piano to sit at.
It had been a while since I'd performed on a proper stage, and this ambush made my heart race. But with everyone watching, there was no graceful escape. I took my seat at the bench, adjusting it with deliberate slowness. Favorite song. Right, if it's a favorite song, I can enjoy playing it. Okay, I whispered to myself. I took a deep breath, rolled my shoulders to release the tension, and placed my fingers on the keys. The familiar ivory felt cool beneath my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. The first notes floated out across the hall, soft and tentative at first, then growing stronger. I had chosen one of my recent compositions, a piece that had become popular in several streaming shows. After a moment of silence, a voice near the stage whispered, "Hey, I know this song." "Me too," another joined in. "It's that pop song that's being used as competition pieces now. I love this one."
"It's by Walker, right? I love his movie compositions."
"The anime soundtracks are better. That one from Cherry Blossom Winter made me cry."
Through the piano's melody, I could hear these conversations floating up from below. A small smile tugged at my lips as I seamlessly transitioned into the movie theme they had mentioned, letting the familiar notes flow from my fingers. "Oh, a Walker medley, nice! Sean's still really good, isn't he? Better than good, this is incredible!" As I played, my confidence grew with each measure. The weight of Victor's presence faded away, replaced by the pure joy of sharing music with an appreciative audience. I could feel their response in the way they swayed slightly to the rhythm, in their soft gasps of recognition as I wove different pieces together. They were enjoying it, really enjoying it, not judging, not comparing, just experiencing the music. Their smiles reflected the same simple pleasure I'd felt playing for my family all those years ago. I let my fingers dance across the keys, adding subtle improvisations to familiar melodies. The music swelled and receded like waves, each piece flowing naturally into the next. In that moment, I remembered why I had fallen in love with music in the first place, not for competition or prestige, but for this connection, this shared experience of joy. Fortunately, Victor was no longer in my line of sight. All I could sense were the people enjoying the music, their faces lit with genuine appreciation. Sharing this moment with so many people filled me with elation. Yes, this is what music should be. Pure joy, unrestrained by rigid expectations or artificial standards. After about 10 minutes of my impromptu medley, I brought the piece to a close with a gentle diminuendo. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then applause erupted throughout the hall, startling in its enthusiasm. I gave a small bow and left the stage, purposefully avoiding Victor's gaze. As I made my way through the crowd, Mike appeared with 2 glasses of champagne. "Man, getting to hear Walker performed live! What luck!" He handed me a glass and patted my shoulder, his comment catching the attention of several nearby classmates who quickly gathered around us.
"Wait, Sean is Walker?"
A former theory classmate's eyes widened.
"No way!"
"You mean those songs we just heard, you wrote them?"
"Yeah," I replied, taking a sip of champagne. Their faces showed pure amazement, as if seeing me for the first time. The questions came rapid fire. Those film scores, that was you?
The symphonic arrangements for the gaming series? The pieces they're using in international competitions now?
I nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and slight embarrassment at their reactions.
Seriously, so that's why you chose those pieces?
You're incredible! Come to think of it, you always had amazing instincts back in school, Sean. The way you interpreted pieces. It was different, but in a good way. Thanks, I said softly, touched by their sincere appreciation. Mike looked at me curiously. Sean, you hadn't told anyone? I shook my head, and he looked surprised. Oh man, sorry. I didn't mean to out you. It's fine, I assured him. I wasn't really hiding it. It just never came up. Yes, I, Sean Walker, am Walker, the composer they were discussing. The journey from that day I left the conservatory to becoming Walker wasn't a straight path, but rather a winding road of rediscovery. After dropping out, when I was feeling lowest, my parents welcomed me home without judgment. My mother kept fresh flowers by the piano just like she had during my childhood. My father would sit in his favorite armchair nearby, reading the newspaper while I played, occasionally humming along off-key. One evening, as I sat listlessly at the piano, my mother called from the kitchen. Play something for us, Sean. Anything you want. I don't know if I...
Just one song, my father joined in. That old jazz piece you used to practice.
So I played, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as my parents responded with their familiar enthusiasm. Just like when I was young, they enjoyed everything I played, celebrating my efforts and praising how far I'd come, even after my perceived failure at the conservatory. That simple moment, playing for my family in our modest living room, brought more joy than any formal performance I'd given before. It reminded me of the pure excitement I'd felt the first time I completed a piece on the piano, that surge of accomplishment unmarred by competition or criticism. I didn't want to give up on music that had brought me such joy. How wonderful would it be to have that feeling in my life forever? True, pursuing excellence leads to creating refined, beautiful music, but focusing only on competition makes it impossible to create music that touches the heart. I realized I was better suited to pursuing my own path, even if it was less conventional. So I stopped comparing myself to others and focused on developing my own music. I played countless pieces I loved, absorbing music of all genres. I attended jazz clubs, rock concerts, traditional folk performances, and classical recitals, taking in new emotions and applying them to my own music. Eventually, I wanted to try composing my own pieces. Unlike the rigid composition assignments from school, I expressed myself freely in theme and message. Sometimes I would stay up all night working on a single phrase until it perfectly captured the feeling I wanted to convey. I converted my small apartment's spare room into a modest recording studio, filling it with second-hand equipment. I recorded some of my better pieces and posted them online under the name Walker, hoping that, like my parents, I could bring joy to others through my music. Gradually, people started following my work. Comments began appearing under my videos. "This helped me get through a rough day. I listened to this while studying.
Please make more music like this."
My reputation grew as an unconventional composer who blended classical training with modern sensibilities. Artists who liked my style commissioned songs. My submissions were chosen for film and TV themes, and by pursuing what I loved, I found freedom to spread my music in my own way. That's when I truly understood that everyone has their own stage to shine on. Some belong in grand concert halls, others in intimate jazz clubs, and some, like me, in the spaces between genres. Back at the reunion, someone asked, "Isn't Walker doing the opening ceremony music for the National Stadium? Sean, you're doing things at that level?" I nodded modestly. Honestly, I never expected to reach this level of success, so that particular commission still made me nervous, albeit happily so. The project would combine classical orchestration with modern electronic elements, exactly the kind of boundary-pushing work I loved.
Whatever,
Victor's voice cut through the excited chatter. He had slunk down from the stage and now stood at the edge of our group.
Being independent just means you're pandering to popular taste. You're just pretending to be an artist.
I tried to let his words roll off me, reminding myself how far I'd come. But then he added,
Amateurs like him can't possibly understand the sophisticated music we create.
Insulting not just me, but also the people who appreciated my music. That I couldn't let slide. I opened my mouth to respond, but someone else beat me to it.
That's harsh, came a voice from the crowd. What do you mean by sophisticated? Does music even work that way?
Victor spun around, clearly startled by the challenge.
What?
This unexpected intervention stopped him in his tracks, and then another voice joined in.
"You were always like this, putting people down and belittling them," said a cellist I remembered from orchestra practice. "Always acting superior, but never actually helping anyone grow."
"Sean dropped out because of your harassment, right?" added another former classmate. "Because you couldn't beat him fairly, you just bullied him until he left."
"After Sean left, you just found new targets," someone else chimed in. "It was honestly pathetic watching you tear down anyone who showed promise."
"You only got away with it because the teachers favored you," said a woman who had been 2 years behind us. "But that won't work anymore. We're not students you can intimidate."
"Yeah, we're adults now. Grow up already."
The voices criticizing Victor grew louder, years of pent-up frustration finally finding release. Then Mike, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up with a knowing look. "Isn't Victor just bitter because his agency is hiring Walker instead of using him?"
Victor's head snapped toward Mike.
"How do you know about that?"
"It's a small industry," Mike shrugged. "Everyone knows your CEO chose Sean over you for that composition, the one for the international dance competition."
"What?"
Victor's face drained of color. It was true. I had received several commissions from Victor's agency over the past year. When I got the requests, I had wondered why they'd hire an outside composer when they had someone talented from my generation in-house. When I discreetly asked about it, the CEO and managers had exchanged uncomfortable glances and said, "About Victor." Apparently, while he had started strong, lately he'd been resting on his past achievements without producing anything noteworthy. He kept recycling the same technical flourishes, showing no growth or innovation. Moreover, he had been interfering with junior composers, causing them to lose confidence. Even in a new environment, he was still up to his old tricks. The higher-ups had finally caught wind of it and had essentially stopped giving him work. As this information spread through the gathering, Victor's face reddened with anger. His hands clenched into fists at his sides.
"You're always getting in my way!"
he shouted, his voice cracking. "You were the one interfering with others," I replied calmly. "I've never tried to stop you from making music." My calm response seemed to enrage him further. He stormed away from our group, but as he passed by me, he spat out,
"If it weren't for you, I could have enjoyed making music. This is all your fault."
We watched as he slumped into a distant seat, glaring at us, but finally falling silent. The reunion gradually returned to normal, though conversation centered around my journey. How, despite dropping out, I had persevered in music. Everyone was supportive and encouraging. "I played your piece at my students' recital last month," shared a former classmate who now taught at a music school. "They loved it. It made them want to practice more."
"My orchestra performed your film suite," said another. "The audience gave us a standing ovation."
They shared their favorite Walker compositions, which songs they loved, mentioned owning my albums. Having my work recognized by my peers meant more than I could express. These were the very people whose opinions I had once feared, now appreciating my music on its own terms. I was truly grateful I had kept pursuing music, even when it meant taking an unconventional path. Though I occasionally felt Victor's glare from across the room, he didn't approach us again. The next time I looked, his seat was empty. A few days later, when I submitted my commissioned piece to his agency, I heard surprising news. Victor had left the agency. Apparently, the reunion had sparked renewed discussion of his past bullying of me and others. The stories spread through the industry, and his reputation, both from conservatory days and present behavior, became widely known. In the music industry, image is as much a tool of trade as talent. Keeping someone whose character was questionable would only hurt the agency, so they decided not to renew his contract. Victor, unsurprisingly, wasn't accepted by other agencies either. Whether he's working independently now, like me, well, that news hasn't reached my ears. Since my identity as Walker became known at the reunion, work requests have increased through my old classmate connections. Mike has even suggested collaborating on a violin and piano duet album. I'm keeping busy while surrounded by the free-spirited music I love. Ironically, I might owe some of my current success to Victor driving me out of the conservatory. If I'd stayed, I might have become trapped in the same rigid mindset that ultimately limited him. I can even feel a tiny bit of gratitude for that, in a way. His music back then, despite his personality, was truly remarkable. I remember a performance he gave of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 that left the entire audience breathless. The talent was real. It was the humanity that was missing. Maybe someday I'll hear him perform again. Perhaps we could even create something together. Music has a way of healing old wounds, of building bridges where walls once stood. That I can think so positively now is thanks to where I am today. Just last week, I received an email from Mrs. Harrison, my first piano teacher. She had seen my name in the credits of a popular film and written to express her pride. "I always knew you'd find your way," she wrote. "Music comes in many forms, and you've discovered yours." Everyone has different paths that suit them. While this independent style works for me, it's not for everyone. Some thrive in the structured environment of orchestras or conservatories. Others find their calling in teaching or music therapy. The key to success is making the most of your situation and being true to what you really want to do. That said, you can't ignore the fundamentals. Mrs. Harrison was right about that. Without them, you won't even make it to the starting line. It's a challenging, somewhat contradictory space to occupy, but I love it. The classical training gives me tools to express modern ideas, while contemporary influences help me reimagine classical pieces. Last night, I sat at my piano, the same one my aunt had given us all those years ago. Though I could afford a newer, more expensive instrument now, this one holds too many memories to replace. As I worked on a new piece, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Heard your music at the grocery store today," she wrote. "Made me smile. Dad says hi." You know what? I think I'll put these feelings into my next composition. Something about coming full circle, about finding your own way back to what you love. About how sometimes the longest road leads you exactly where you need to be. Creating music for others, hoping to help someone somehow, that's how I face music each day. Whether it's a film score that moves people to tears, a game soundtrack that energizes players, or a simple melody that makes someone's grocery shopping more enjoyable, it all matters. It all connects us. Each morning I sit at my piano and remember that scared student being bullied out of his dreams. Then I play a few notes and that memory fades, replaced by the joy of creating something new. Because in the end, music isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about sharing a piece of your soul with the world, hoping it resonates with someone else's. And sometimes that resonance creates the most beautiful harmony of all. In my studio, there's a small frame containing my unfinished degree from Palmer Conservatory. Beside it hangs a platinum record for my first film soundtrack. Together, they tell the story not of failure and success, but of finding my own path in music. They remind me that every experience, even the painful ones, can lead to something beautiful if you keep your heart open to the music.